Thanks so much. Thank you, Mark, for those very kind words, and for the others who spoke. It is humbling to receive this award. It's wonderful to be here at Villanova. For the first time, I've actually had the opportunity to visit this university, and I've had a wonderful experience. And I'm looking forward to talking with you this evening about this problem that we face, the issue of climate change. It's meaningful to me to be speaking to you on the eve of this new commitment to environmental sustainability that was announced earlier. To me, environmental sustainability is another word for stewardship. And that's really what it's about, right? Making sure that we do preserve the wonders of this planet for our children and grandchildren, for future generations. And whether you approach it from the standpoint of faith or the standpoint of just our commitment to preserve this, what may be a unique example in the universe. And we've seen some remarkable things about the universe over the past few days, the wonders of the universe. We've imaged a black hole and the event horizon around a black hole, but we still only know of one planet in the universe that can support life. That's this planet, and we ought to take care of it. So I will talk about this challenge. The hockey stick in the climate wars, of course, refers to this curve that you were so nice to talk about, that my co-authors and I published literally 2 decades ago. As of March 15th, that curve is 20 years old. And when we published that graph, whether I realized it or not at the time, as a young postdoctoral researcher, I had now essentially embarked on a very different path from the one that I had thought I had set out on, a path that would lead me to the center of what is arguably the most contentious societal debate we've ever had, the debate about climate change and what to do about it. And I've ultimately grown to embrace that role and that opportunity, even though it isn't what I set out to do. What more important endeavor could I devote myself to than trying to make sure that we have an informed conversation about what might be the greatest challenge we face as a civilization. So I'm going to take you through, first of all, we'll start out just with a little bit of a discussion of the science. And I know a lot of you here are familiar with the science, and you've seen enough graphs and data. But there are just a few essential points that I want to make here. First of all, the greenhouse effect is not new controversial science. It goes back nearly 2 centuries. Joseph Fourier, who lived so long ago, we only have portraits of him. We don't have a photograph of him. Understood that the atmosphere had this warming influence on the surface of the planet, and over the last 2 centuries, we have been refining our understanding of the greenhouse effect and of the problem of climate change. But the basics go back nearly 2 centuries. Further back, by the way, than the theory of evolution, I would add. The fact that we're increasing the greenhouse effect, the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, when I first put this graph together for a TED Talk a little more than a decade ago, that was an appropriate scale. But we have to add not 1, but now, as of last year, 2 vertical tick marks to that scale. If we are to plot where, oops, no, it's not there. What's supposed to appear there would be a red dot that is at about the same height as Hawaii in that line there. That's roughly where we are now in terms of our CO2 concentrations. We've passed 410 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. Pre-industrial levels were about 280. If we continue on the course that we're on, we will pass 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere in a matter of a couple decades. That's the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere that probably commits us to more than 2 degrees Celsius warming of the planet. What most scientists will tell you really puts us in the danger zone when it comes to the impacts of climate change. So there is great urgency. What we wouldn't be able to explain, some people think that the theory is based on the fact that we've seen the planet warm, and so we have to come up with some explanation for it. But that's not the case. The greenhouse effect is fundamental physics that goes back nearly 2 centuries. I've just shown you how fundamentally we are increasing the greenhouse effect through fossil fuel burning. What we wouldn't be able to explain scientifically would be if the Earth were not warming up. We would be stumped. It has to warm up based on our understanding of the basic physics that are involved, and it has warmed up. Now, here you can see where things stood about 6 or 7 years ago, where it looked like things had sort of flattened out a bit, and the critics, the climate change contrarians, were very proudly announced that global warming had stopped, that there was a pause in global warming, nothing to worry about. Well, let's update that a little bit. And the New York Times is very helpful here because we have 3 consecutive headlines. 2014, the warmest year on record. So we'll update the curve. There we are. 2015, the warmest year on record. So we'll update the curve again. 2016, the warmest year on record. So we'll update the curve again. 2017, here's the good news. 2017 was not the warmest year on record. It was only the 2nd warmest year. And 2018 was just barely in the top 5. Well, this onslaught of record warm years, for example, those 3 consecutive 2014, 2015, 2016 records, the critics will say, well, these things can happen naturally. Stovetop temperatures very naturally. There's nothing to worry about, these poor frogs. Well, we decided to actually look at that a couple years ago. We published a study where we used a combination of climate models and observations to estimate the likelihood that you would see 3 consecutive record-breaking years like we saw in 2014, 2015, 2016, given just sort of the random natural variability of the climate system. And I could go through the abstract and talk about some of our statistical observations, but I think it should suffice for me to simply put up the headline from Discover Magazine's summary of our findings. The record global warming streak of 2014 through 2016, a snowball's chance in hell that this was natural, which is a pretty good statistical assessment of what we found. And by the way, a snowball is a good analogy here because, as you may be aware, there is a senator who once introduced a snowball on the Senate floor to disprove 200 years of radiative physics and climate science. We'll come back to that. So there's overwhelming evidence from the observations of a warming planet, and even if you threw out all those temperature observations, I could show you dozens of independent lines of evidence that tell an internally consistent story of a planet that's warming up and a climate that is changing, much as we expect it to as we continue to pump these greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that's what leads the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in their most recent assessment. These are conservative assessment reports. So you get 3 scientists in a room. As many of you know, it's hard to get them to agree on just about anything. And so when you get thousands of scientists together, what you're going to come up with is sort of a lowest common denominator. It's going to be a conservative assessment. And so when the IPCC says that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal, what that means is that the warming of the climate system is unequivocal. Scientists aren't debating that. Scientists are not debating that. And when the IPCC says it's extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming, you can bet that they're probably being overly conservative. And why is that overly conservative? Well, it turns out that if it were natural factors alone that were driving the system, volcanoes, small but measurable fluctuations in the sun, the models tell us the Earth should have cooled over the last half century, and it's warmed in spite of that. So we are responsible for more than 100% of the warming that has occurred. because we overcame what would have been a natural cooling trend, a temporary natural cooling trend. And the technical report actually details that, if you read the technical chapter of the report. So what about the future? Predictions are hard, especially about the future. It's sometimes attributed to Yogi Berra. It sounds like a Yogi Berra ism. It was actually Niels Bohr, the physicist, who said that. Predictions are hard, especially about the future. And these are, it depends on what we do, right? We could decide to tackle this problem now. We could prevent crossing that 2 degrees Celsius warming threshold that I talked about before. We can still do that. There is urgency, but as I like to say, there is agency. We are still in a position to control our destiny. But if we continue with business as usual, burning of fossil fuels, by the end of the century, we will have warmed the planet between 4 to 5 degrees Celsius. Let me translate that. That's 7 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit warming of the planet. And by the way, the Arctic, twice that much because of the amplifying effect of melting ice. We're talking about a different planet. And we were talking about polar bears just a little bit earlier, and I care about polar bears. I care about the Great Barrier Reef. I want to leave behind a world with the beauty and wonder of the world that I grew up on, and that's a world that's threatened. But even if you don't care about polar bears, even if you don't care about any of that, you might care about unprecedented wildfires and superstorms and floods and heat waves and droughts like we have seen in recent years. And we can now say that this is the face of climate change. We would not be seeing these unprecedented, extreme, damaging weather events in the absence of our warming of the planet. So, then you ask, why have we not acted to the extent necessary? Why, for example, do we have a president who is actually dismantling a half-century of environmental protections that were put in place, I would point out, by both Republican and Democratic administrations? Well, that takes us out of the domain of science and, of course, into the domain of politics. Back in 2002, which seems like a long time ago now, remember when this felt recent, there was a famous memo that was leaked. It was a memo from Frank Luntz, who was a Republican pollster. He was advising his clients, essentially fossil fuel interests, that there was a narrow window of opportunity, and that window of opportunity was disappearing. The public was becoming convinced that climate change is real, and if they become convinced that there is a scientific consensus, they will demand action. They will demand action be taken. But what Luntz said was, based on his polling and his focus groups, there was still a narrow window of opportunity to insert doubt, to double down on doubt and denial and disinformation, to confuse the public and policymakers, to create the illusion of a scientific debate. That's all you need. You don't need to win the argument, you just need to divide the public to prevent action from happening. And that's what he advised his clients to do. And so it's no surprise that we have seen precisely that. There's a wonderful book by my good friend Naomi Oreskes and her co-author Eric Conway, made into a film, Merchants of Doubt, that details the strategy by which fossil fuel industry, interest groups, and the politicians in their pay, and the talking heads that they hire, and even some of the scientists with impressive credentials who have become spokespeople for their cause, how they manufactured doubt, how they hid their own research, their own internal research, fossil fuel industry research. ExxonMobil in the 1970s, there's an internal document where they use the word catastrophic, their own scientists, to describe what could happen if we continue with business as usual burning of fossil fuels. Now, if this sounds like a familiar strategy, it's because it's exactly what the tobacco industry did decades ago. It's the tobacco playbook, and the fossil fuel industry used that, they appropriated that playbook, and they even hired some of the same scientists who were denying the effect of tobacco on human health in recent times have been denying the impact of fossil fuel burning on the health of the entire planet. I sometimes call them deniers for hire, and they've been very effective in helping create this false appearance of a debate where there is none. Now, as we've alluded to, I found myself in the center of this fractious debate because of a curve that my co-authors and I published now literally 2 decades ago. It came to be known as the hockey stick because of its shape, and it became an icon in the climate change debate. And so I suddenly found myself at the center of that debate, a young postdoctoral researcher who thought he was going to be spending his time in a lab crunching numbers and solving, using computational approaches to problem solving. That's what got me into science. That's what got me excited about doing research in this area. But whether I realized it or not at the time, once we published that graph, that fundamentally changed my career path, and I would find myself at the center of this very fractious public debate over climate change and what to do about it because of the powerful nature of this graph. It told a simple story. You didn't need to understand the complex workings of Earth's climate to understand what that graph is telling us, that there's something unprecedented taking place today in our climate, and by implication, it probably has something to do with us. And so it was attacked by, again, fossil fuel interest groups and their hired hands, hired scientists for hire, whose role it was to create doubt and confusion and to attack any iconic science that supports the case for concern over climate change. And I found myself in the center of those attacks. Decades later, there's no longer a hockey stick. There's a hockey league, if you will. There are dozens of these reconstructions that have been done that all arrive at the same conclusion. The details differ, but the bottom line conclusion, the recent warming is unprecedented as far back as we can go, even more than 1,000 years. In fact, a few years ago, there was a study that was published that I sometimes joke that it overthrew the conventional wisdom, and there it is against the original hockey stick. And I will forgive you if you can't see the difference between the two curves. This is, a decade and a half earlier, using far more widespread data, different statistical approaches, and they came up with pretty much the same answer. And in fact, there are now some reconstructions that go back thousands of years. And the recent warming spike, as far as we can tell, is unprecedented as far back as we can go. And that's now probably tens of thousands of years and maybe longer. So we are engaged in this unprecedented experiment with our climate. And that's the sort of evidence that has led the very staid, conservative IPCC to not only reaffirm, but in fact extend our original conclusions that the recent warming is probably unprecedented at least 1,400 years, and in fact, probably tens of thousands of years. There are studies that now suggest that to be the case. I alluded to the fact that the hockey stick recently had its birthday. There were actually 2 publications. In 1998, in the journal Nature, we published the first version that went back 600 years. And so it had its birthday last year on Earth Day, April 22nd, 2018. The original article was published in Nature on Earth Day, April 22nd, 1998, when I was still a fairly young guy. It's amazing how time goes by. 2 decades later, and then a year later, in 1999, we published the 1,000-year reconstruction. That's usually what is termed the hockey stick, that 1,000-year curve. And it has become an icon in the climate change debate. And as a result, I and my co-authors have been attacked and vilified, as you've heard, by those who find the science inconvenient. Now, some would call this politicization of science. In fact, I think somebody might have used that term earlier. I prefer a different term. I think a better term is the scientization of politics. If you think about it, that's something that's even more pernicious and an even better characteristic of where we are today, a very better characterization of where we are today, where science is just another way of waging politics. It used to be said, in fact, the great Senator Daniel P. Moynihan of New York once famously said, "You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts." Well, those were fateful words, because as we know today, you are entitled to your own facts. alternative facts, they're called. And if you don't like the science as assessed by the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, founded in the mid-19th century by a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, to serve as a neutral arbiter of policy-relevant science for the government. If you don't like the conclusions of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences or every scientific society in the U.S. or in Europe or around the world that has weighed in, the overwhelming scientific consensus is that climate change is real and caused by human activity and already presenting a great risk to us as a civilization. Well, if you don't like those conclusions, if you don't like the conclusions of the world's scientists, there are entire cable networks that are willing to present an alternative universe where the greenhouse effect doesn't exist. And if that's true, then I guess we should be a frozen planet and Venus shouldn't exist. The greenhouse effect doesn't exist. Climate change is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. There are newspapers, the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, the entire worldwide Murdoch media empire. There is this echo chamber that is willing to create an alternative universe. And too often, people in today's sort of fragmented media environment become trapped in sort of an epistemic bubble of closure, where they're sealed off from facts, from viewpoints that might challenge their preconceptions, their misconceptions. And it's why you can have a substantial fraction of our population thinking that climate change isn't real, or at least isn't human-caused, it's natural, despite the fact that there is a 99% plus degree of consensus among the world's scientists. That's the scientization of politics, and I've talked about my own experiences in that context in my book, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, and I'll tell you just a few stories, because I have some interesting stories to tell. Let me tell you. One of the luxuries of having gone through what I have gone through is that you have some great stories to tell. And let me talk about Ken Cuccinelli. He was the Attorney General of Virginia back in 2009. He was elected office in 2009, and his first act as Attorney General was, oh, that's right, sorry, yes. His first act as Attorney General, he wanted to censor the state seal because it exposed some of the inappropriate anatomy of the Roman goddess Virtus. He felt that that just wasn't appropriate. He wanted to change that. It was his second act as Attorney General, was to subpoena all of my personal emails from the time I was at the University of Virginia. And by the way, go Cavaliers. Sorry, I know it's a Villanova audience. But, you know, I did have to celebrate last week. It was pretty exciting. See my Cavaliers finally win that tournament. You guys have had your share, trust me. Well, so he sued the University of Virginia for all of my personal emails so that he could go through these and try to find something to embarrass or discredit me and therefore call into question the hockey stick. I'm sure it had nothing to do with the fact that his primary funders were fossil fuel interests. It's just an honest interest on his part in understanding the science, I'm sure. And so he issued this civil subpoena. And it was denounced by scientists from around the state. The AAUP, the ACLU saw this as a fairly blatant effort to intimidate an academic whose findings might be inconvenient to the special interests who fund Mr. Cuccinelli's campaigns. FIRE, which is a conservative academic organization that often fights what they perceive as political correctness in academia, they denounced Cuccinelli's actions because they understood it doesn't matter what your politics are, what side of the political, ideological spectrum you are on. The idea that an attorney general could go after an academic simply because he doesn't like their ideas is chilling, should be chilling to anybody, regardless of their politics. And so they spoke out. 900 scientists from the state of Virginia. I didn't realize there were 900 scientists in the state of Virginia who signed an open letter denouncing Cuccinelli's attack against us. The AAAS, largest science member organization in the U.S., the American Meteorological Society, the journal Nature spoke out against what they saw as an assault on science. Washington Post published no less than 5 editorials denouncing what they called Cuccinelli's witch hunt against me and the University of Virginia. And their award-winning editorial cartoonist, Tom Towles, weighed in on the matter not once, but twice. And I do have to say this is my favorite. And yes, Galileo does get a mention here. Poor Galileo. He wants to see his emails too. I don't mind being compared to Galileo. I guess that's okay. That's twice tonight, so thank you. Well, and I went on, by the way, to write a book with Tom Towles, the Madhouse Effect, using his cartoons over the years to tell this story in sort of a somewhat lighthearted and irreverent manner. Well, let's follow up with Ken Cuccinelli here. So his subpoena was shot down by the lower court on a technicality. In his 40-page filing to the court, he had failed to provide evidence of wrongdoing on my part. And so they threw out the case. He, of course, appealed to the state Supreme Court, which ultimately ruled against the case with prejudice, meaning they never want to see an attorney general come back to the court with something like this again. So that was a battle won. Cuccinelli went on to run for governor of Virginia in the next election, and a certain climate scientist there couldn't resist the invitation to become involved in that election. And that is me up there. I ended up introducing the former president of the United States, Bill Clinton, who introduced Terry Mcauliffe at the final campaign rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Terry Mcauliffe was victorious. He became the governor of Virginia, resurrected the Virginia Climate Advisory Board that had been disappeared under the previous administration, appointed yours truly to that board. Well, Ken Cuccinelli went off to, I'm not making this up, folks. He went off to help run an oyster farm on Tangier Island. This is an island in the Chesapeake Bay that is succumbing to the effects of global sea level rise. You can't make this stuff up. You just can't make it up. But hold your applause. Because you may have seen the Cooch, by the way, is his nickname. To those of us who know him well, the Cooch has been named as a possible successor now to run the Department of Homeland Security. Now, what is the greatest national security threat that we face in the years ahead? If you listen to our national security community, it is exactly that. It is climate change. They characterize that as a threat multiplier. It takes existing tensions and competition for resources, food, water, space, which are becoming more scarce because of climate change, and it creates sort of a perfect storm for unprecedented national security challenges. So there's something deeply disturbing to me about the notion that somebody with such antipathy for science in general and for climate science specifically would be considered for this position. Well, we face some challenges today. We do have continuing theme of the scientization of politics. We do have a President, Donald Trump, who rejects the overwhelming science of climate change. That's the true wall that he has constructed, the wall separating him from the reality of climate change. And yes, we will all pay for it if he has his way. He has appointed a veritable dream team as it were, of, to use a basketball analogy, of fossil fuel industry lobbyists and climate change deniers to run his cabinet. And so it is important, given this unprecedented political challenge we face right now, we do need to speak out. And I have been speaking out increasingly in recent years. I spoke at the science rally that was held shortly after Donald Trump became president on Earth Day 2016. I led the march with this really annoying guy in the bow tie who claims he likes science. I don't know. He's my good friend Bill Nye, the science guy. Some of you recognize him. And Bill is wonderful sort of ambassador for science and has been out in front, recognizes that you have to get off the fence. When science and when our global environment is under the kind of threat that it is under today, you have to get off the fence. And Bill has been out there lending his voice and his imprimatur to pushing back against the anti-science and the anti-environmental views of this current administration. And I've been doing what I can, as have other scientists and science communicators. Elections do have consequences. Terry Mcauliffe has become a friend of mine. And when Donald Trump threatened to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, Terry Mcauliffe was among the first governor to say, we don't care what Trump does, the state of Virginia is still in. We will still meet our commitment to the Paris Accord. And that helped create a movement around the country where states and cities and companies and other institutions signed on to the We Are Still In movement. And it turns out that even in the absence now of leadership at the national level, without support from the executive branch, a president who clearly is actually not committed to doing what he can to meet our obligations under Paris, and a divided Congress, which is unable to act. We've seen cities and states and municipalities and companies all band together and act in whatever way they are able to. And it looks like we will still meet our obligations under Paris, despite whether or not we have leadership from the president. It looks like we are on track to meet our obligations. And Terry Mcauliffe said to me after he issued this statement that Virginia was still in, he reminded me that elections have consequences. And no truer words were ever spoken. Elections do have consequences. And there are lots of things that we can do to try to act on this problem. And there are all sorts of voluntary things that we can do in our everyday lives that decrease our carbon footprint, and we should all do those things. But there's nothing more powerful than expressing your voice, than making your voice heard at the voting booth and coming out and voting for politicians who will do what's right for us rather than what's best for the fossil fuel interests who might be funding their campaigns. If we don't come out and vote in every single election, then we will get politicians who will not be acting in our best interest. So voting is critical, and elections do have consequences. I want to, Mark mentioned this hearing that I testified at, this House Science Committee hearing a couple of years ago. Presiding over that hearing was the chair of the committee, Lamar Smith of Texas, a climate change denier. We had a friendly chat before the hearing. It turns out he's a Yale graduate himself, and he said, oh yeah, I never came over to the physics side of the campus though. But things weren't so friendly once we started getting into the hearing. And so I'll just play one. According to an article that came out a few days ago in the journal Science, Chairman Smith was on record at the Heartland Institute. This is a climate change denying Koch brothers climate change denier conference every year. And Chairman Smith spoke at that conference.
Dr. Mann, don't mischaracterize that.
Well, let me finish.
No, they do not say that they're deniers, and you should not say they are.
Well, we can have that discussion. I'd be happy to. Let me finish.
Be accurate in your description.
I stand by my statement, so can I finish my
I'd like to repent.
Yes. So he indicated at this conference that he, according to science, and I'm quoting from him, he sees his role in this committee as a tool to advance his political agenda rather than a forum to examine important issues facing the U.S. research community. As a scientist, I find that deeply disturbing.
Dr. Mann, who said that?
This is according to Science Magazine, one of the most respected outlets.
And who are they quoting?
This is the author, Jeffrey Mervis, who wrote that article. I'd be happy to send to the committee.
And that is not known as an objective writing or magazine.
Well, it's Science Magazine. I told you I've had some interesting experiences. Here's a critical point, though. That was the Science Committee 2 years ago. That was the Republican chair of the Science Committee. Now under Democratic leadership, Eddie Bernice Johnson, she is now the chair of that committee, and they recently had a hearing about climate change. And what was eventful wasn't the fact that Eddie Bernice Johnson and the Democrats are attempting to use that committee to have a meaningful conversation about climate change. What was eventful is that the Republicans on that committee did not challenge the science. Now, why is that? Well, I said elections have consequences. The last election ushered in a Democratic House, including politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, because everything these days has to be just a three-letter, AOC and the GND, the Green New Deal. And Republicans are now looking at that, and they're looking at the public, they're looking at the extreme weather events that have played out, they're looking at the children who are now demonstrating around the world for action on climate change, and I'll come back to that, and they're seeing the writing on the wall, and they're realizing if they don't come to the table now and engage in the worthy debate about what to do about this problem, they're going to get a policy solution that they don't like. And so whether or not we do see something like the Green New Deal enacted, it has moved the entire window of our discourse back in the right direction, where now we have Republicans coming to the table. And there are other stories to be told here along these lines. You may recognize Matt Gaetz. He's been one of the fiercest supporters of the president, Donald Trump. This was a statement that he made a week ago. I didn't come to Congress to argue with a thermometer, and I think that more of my colleagues need to realize that the science of global warming is irrefutable. Okay, this is one of the most conservative Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, he lives in a coastal district in Florida, and it's very hard to deny that there's a problem when the people in your district are dealing with that problem on a regular basis. They're dealing with the damages of climate change. They don't have time to question whether or not the science is there because they're dealing with the impacts. And their governor, DeSantis, who many feared would execute an anti-environmental agenda when he became governor of Florida, has really surprised the critics and has appointed good people to science policy positions, is enacting policies to deal with climate change. So there does seem to be some suggestion that maybe that window of discourse is moving back in the direction where we can start to have that worthy debate, because there is a worthy debate to be had about what we do to deal with this problem. There is no longer a worthy debate to be had about whether we have a problem. And maybe, just maybe, we're moving in that direction. And of course, as I said, part of why that is happening, many of you probably heard the name Greta Thunberg. She's this 16-year-old girl from Sweden who is autistic and is just a remarkably focused and effective public speaker and advocate for action. And she's been striking. She has began striking, striking from school to raise awareness about climate change, to demand that the adults in the world take action, and has spurred a global movement now. Alexandria Villanova has been inspired by Greta and has been striking from school every Friday just outside the UN building in New York City. And the two of them have really helped ignite a global movement where children are now striking to raise awareness, to demand action. They're calling policymakers to account, taking them to task for not acting to preserve the planet for them and future generations. And I think we've seen a few things come together. We've seen this children's movement, and by the way, we have a letter that just appeared in the journal Science today, a letter of support from many of the leading climate scientists in the world, support for these kids and what they're doing, because we do need to support them, and the scientists need to support them. We need to provide them with the support to continue to do what they're doing. They're making a real difference. And so it's this children's movement combined with unprecedented extreme weather events that make the impacts of climate change undeniable, because we're seeing them play out in real time on our television screens and our newspaper headlines, combined with our evolving politics. And all this has come together in a perfect storm, to use that analogy again, where as sort of as dispirited as one might have been a couple years ago, given the election of a climate change denying president who sought to literally dismantle the environmental protections of the past half century, that might have been cause for optimism, if not for the fact that it seems to have led to this reaction now that may ultimately move us to where we need to be far faster than we imagined. And I think we're getting very close to that tipping point, not the tipping point we fear, which are the tipping points in the climate system. And there is reason to worry about that, where we warm the planet enough that we set in motion disastrous changes that are unstoppable. That's a real concern. But there's another kind of tipping point, which is the tipping point in public consciousness. And I think that that's happening now on climate, and it's reason for cautious optimism. And finally, with here at a college, with a college audience and a number of students I know in the audience, I wrote a piece last fall for the Knowledge Review, talking about my experiences, my first semester at UC Berkeley in 1984. These were the Reagan years, and Ronald Reagan had just been reelected to a second term, and Berkeley College Republicans were marching on campus triumphantly, and activism had largely disappeared from a university that had become known for activism. But what sparked a reignition of activism was the policies, the apartheid policies of South Africa. And within the first couple of years, this became a galvanizing movement on campus. The students ultimately forced the UC regents to divest the entire University of California's holdings and companies that do business with South Africa. And the divestment movement spread across the entire nation and ultimately forced the collapse of that regime. It forced the end of the policies of apartheid. Those were college students. That happened because of activism by college students. And today, we're at this critical juncture. We're so close to the precipice, that tipping point in ensuring that we act on this problem. And college students are going to play every bit as important a role here today as they played with that movement and movements that came before. Much of these cultural tipping points started at university campuses. And so I say to the students in the audience, don't be depressed, don't be dispirited, dismayed. There is urgency, but there is still agency. We can make a difference, and it won't happen if we don't try. So I think I will leave it on that note, and I guess we have some time maybe for questions. Thank you.
Professor Mann's going to be meeting with undergrad and graduate students, environmental science, environmental studies students at 10 o'clock over at Mendel, right? Mendel 154, and it's open to everyone.
Please come out.
Is that Greta has inspired Villanovans to do their own Friday strike. It's tomorrow at noon at the Oriole. So if you want to be in the spirit of Greta, show up tomorrow at noon. So, we don't have a microphone, so I'm going to ask if you want to ask a question, just stand up and tell us who you are, and then ask your question, and you might have to repeat it.
Please. Student.
How would you say is a way the average person, grad student, even down to anyone, can convey scientific principles to the public and try and put narrative in and try and say even kids, maybe get across something to parents and try and spread ideas that maybe they weren't taught in school or they grew up.
Thanks for the question, and sort of to summarize it, how can just anybody, how can any one of us try to help inform the understanding of the science? What in our everyday lives, how can we contribute to a better public understanding of the science and its implications? And I think we live in a social environment today that offers unique challenges but unique opportunities. In the world of social media, in particular, there is this on-ramp that we all have to directly interacting with the rest of the world. We don't have to rely on media anymore to sort of get our message out. And that's very empowering. And so, participating in online environments and social media, trying to inform your social network, your peer network, and that can take many forms. That can to be proactive, just trying to get information out there. It can also involve trying to rebut bad information, false information, and connecting with people. I think it's really important that we meet people where they are. When we present climate change as an abstract problem involving polar bears up in the Arctic, it seems so distant and far away that it's difficult to really to engage people. And so we have to connect the dots and understand how climate change is impacting our daily lives now in terms of destructive events. So many of us now know people who've lost their homes in floods and wildfires out west. The island of Puerto Rico, the worst, I would call it a natural disaster, but it was an unnatural disaster. It's a disaster made worse by climate change. So connecting the dots, making people understand that there are direct implications that they might not have been aware of, challenges that we're already facing, national security threats that have been heightened by climate change. So, as I said, you can vote. That's one way to make your voice heard, but you can write letters to the local paper. You can just speak out, talk to friends and family and people in your church group or your classmates or the workplace. The first step is talking about it, making sure it's part of the conversation. And part of the problem has been that that it's something that people prefer not to talk about because it has been turned into a partisan issue, and people are sometimes afraid of alienating people. We can't be. How can we fear alienating people about the greatest challenge and crisis that we face? We have to be willing to confront people and to sometimes have those difficult conversations. Some people will be unmovable. They're, coming from a place of entrenched ideology and sort of tribal sort of politics. They've been told that climate change is a hoax, and to be a self-respecting conservative, they're supposed to hold to that viewpoint. Some people you won't be able to reach, but many you will. Many folks are actually not perpetrators of disinformation, but victims of misinformation and disinformation. And a little bit of knowledge can go a long way, and not just knowledge, but providing resources. You might not convince them today, but if you can say, hey, next time you come across one of these climate change, talking points, why don't you go to the website, skepticalscience.com, and see what they have to say about that. And it's a great resource because it takes all the standard denialist talking points and provides the responses, the actual scientific response at the beginner, intermediate, and advanced level. And you can download it onto your smartphone. It's a great thing to have at Thanksgiving, and Uncle Charlie shows up, he watches certain news channels, and it's like, well, no, Uncle Charlie, that's number 4 on the skeptical science list, and actually the science says that, and there you have it. But thanks for the question. Thank you. Question here? Oh, actually, sorry. You were first, yep. Well, science, it's, to me, having a career in science is the greatest thing you could hope for. The idea that people will pay you to do the thing that you would be doing anyway, the thing you're passionate about is figuring out how things work, understanding the way the world works, and using that understanding to hopefully helping solve some of the pressing problems that we face. What greater, blessing, if you will, could there be than being enabled to spend your life doing what it is you're passionate about and figuring out how things work and solving problems. To me, when I'm talking to audiences of young or potential young scientists, I try to give them a sense of what it is that I find exciting about the process of science, the process of discovery, of figuring out, and I like to use examples of problems that fascinated me and how I went about trying to solve those problems. So I think sharing the excitement, sharing the passion, sharing the wonder of nature that drives scientific exploration. We live in a world today where there's so much competition for the attention span, and we compete with digital devices that are very engaging, and so we have to find new and inventive ways to explain and show how science really is every bit as exciting as that app that you might have been playing with, and that you can actually rather than simply relying on something that someone else has put out there for you, you can develop your own game, your own challenges, your own puzzles, and that's what science does. It provides you an avenue for charting out your own course and finding your own wonder in nature. Yeah. Oh, sorry, and then we'll get to you. Yeah. Well, okay, sure. Yeah, and then we'll come back to you. Yep. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I was until now. No, I'm just kidding. No, it is easy to become dispirited, depressed, given that we're seeing the slow disappearance of the world that we grew up in and we love. But what's empowering is to know that we're not beyond the point of no return yet. Will some bad things happen? Well, some bad things are already happening. If you're Puerto Rico, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're Houston, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're California, dangerous climate change has arrived. If you're Miami Beach, and I can go on and on and on. Some bad stuff is already happening. Other bad stuff is pretty much baked in at this point. It's going to happen simply from the greenhouse gases we've already put into the atmosphere and the additional warming that's going to happen from them. And we're going to need to adapt to those changes that are unavoidable. But we have to prevent those changes that still are avoidable. And so rather than it being rather than seeing this as sort of an unavoidable threat, we should think about it as it's how bad we let it get is really a direct consequence of our actions, and so that should be empowering, right? That we can prevent the worst from happening. We can still save the Great Barrier Reef. We can still save the amphibians, or many of them. Again, there is no true magic number, but 2 degrees Celsius is often held out as the warming where we do start to see very large loss of biodiversity, devastating coastal inundation, unprecedented, fatal sort of levels of heat in the tropics, and the list goes on and on. At 2 degrees Celsius, things start to look really bad. But we can still act to avert 2 degrees Celsius warming. Now, I think this number was mentioned earlier. Somewhere in the range of, the next 10 years, we do have to bring carbon emissions globally down by about 5% a year for the next 10 years and beyond if we're going to keep warming below those levels. And that's just a matter of the math. If you do the math, it's unforgiving. We do have to do that. And every year where we don't do that, it means it's got to drop even faster because of the lost opportunity. So it's still doable. There are no physical laws that say we can't avoid causing that much warming of the planet. It's simply a matter of political willpower. And political will can change dramatically. We've seen that We've seen public opinion galvanized. We rose to the occasion, in World War II, the threat of World War II, the Apollo project. We've risen to the occasion, with these great challenges in the past, and there's no reason that we can't this time. It's a political. If anything, it's really a matter of political willpower. And once again, we get the politicians that we vote for. And so voting, it comes down to voting in politicians who will help us rather than oppose us in confronting this challenge.
Thank you. We have to
One,
end there.
oh, I did promise, sir. So one last question, yes.
Increments that create climate change. If you were to devise a way for us to recreate the apartheid, like we did at Berkeley, removing apartheid by one thing that people could do all over, forget about the politics, we're taking the ground up to change climate change, where would our focus be? I'm assuming it might be on divesting from companies. I don't know. You tell me.
Well, that's a reasonable, proposal, and there is a divestment movement, not just by college campuses. The Rockefeller Brothers Foundation. Remember the legacy of the Rockefeller oil, and yet they have chosen to divest of fossil fuels out of their sense of responsibility to, preserve civilization. And so college campuses, there is a movement, and it's a challenge because, the funds that institutions are invested in are often very diverse, and often there are fossil fuel holdings that can be hidden in mutual funds, and so it's not an easy thing to do. And some, university endowment managers are still resisting doing this, and some universities are resisting doing this, but it's not going to happen if there isn't, enough. Absolutely, if there isn't some impetus on the part of students and faculty, some pressure brought to bear to at least get administrations to consider doing that. It did, indeed. There are those who say that divestment doesn't work, but there are examples to the contrary, and the apartheid movement is one such example. Because of the message it sends. As much as the direct financial impact, it's really the message that it sends, that we won't lend, moral license to these activities any further. So that's something that I think colleges and universities should consider. I have to be careful because I can't say that Penn State has done that. Penn State has not chosen to divest, and so I'm not in a position to tell Villanova that they have to. I would like to see Penn State do that, and there is a movement on campus trying to force them to do that, and that's something I just spoke at Vassar College a few days ago. And there's a student organization that's pressuring their president, and their president was at my presentation, and the issue of divestment came up, and we had an interesting conversation in the room about that. And I think there's a civil conversation that can be had. It shouldn't be confrontational, but I think university presidents should listen to what the students have to say, especially when it involves an issue like climate change, which is about sustainability. It is about our stewardship to this planet. And I would think that an institution of faith, institution that values faith tradition would think about it in those terms. Our mission to preserve creation, if you will, and to be stewards over creation. Thank you.